During the tea and coffee service, the guy in front of me started snapping his finger at the stewardess. Oh my god, they're so badly behaved. How did this airline go from being one of the most profitable ventures to financial ruin in a matter of 10 years? In 2025, this airline seems to be desperate for just about every single penny that they can get. Money! But things sure as hell weren't always this way. Today I'm going to be flying from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia to Colombo, Sri Lanka in a flight that was less than desirable to find out what's going on. Sri Lankan Airlines was known for its premium service, top-notch products and state-of-the-art operational efficiency in the late 90s and early 2000s, arguably a time when Sri Lanka itself was facing the most challenging part of its modern history, battling a 30-year civil conflict and a tsunami that claimed 35,000 lives. So what exactly happened on the Sri Lankan Airlines timeline that caused the inevitable ruin of a product that was once known and loved by the world? Today I want to try and look at some of these issues, and I understand that Sri Lankans themselves may find this topic a little heavy and uneasy, but hopefully we can get to the bottom of what went wrong and if things will ever get better.
I will, thank you.
Now today we're starting off at KLIA, Sri Lankan's only Malaysian destination. But to understand the whole downfall of this airline, we need to go back to the year 1998. This was when the airline was still known as Air Lanka, another state-owned enterprise at the mercy of poor decisions and weak leadership. And that is when Emirates came into the equation. Now in a bid to turn this whole thing around, Sri Lanka sold a 40% stake to the Gulf-based carrier, and Emirates was not going to treat Air Lanka like charity.
I don't need your charity!
Instead, they first rebranded the airline and ran it like an actual business. So this man, Peter Hill, was at the controls, and the first course of action that they undertook was to get rid of the dated TriStars that the airline was using and replaced them with A330s and A340s. Ah yes, I know, classic and all, but it wasn't what the industry needed at the time going forward. Now one of the things that they did was to retrain the staff and digitize the entire system to bring it onto par with the likes of regional peers like Singapore Airlines and Cathay Pacific. They even redesigned the logo from this to this in a bid to give the airline a fresh appearance. And against all odds, it actually worked. From 2002 to 2007, the airline turned consistent annual profits amidst a civil war and a tsunami. Tourism, the entire lifeline of the country, was in ruin, but somehow the airline worked. So just let that sink in for a second. A tsunami, a war that came with a high-profile attack on the airport, didn't stop the airline from being a profitable venture. Now the check-in experience today was nothing short of polite and unrushed, even though it took an eternity filling out what I think was entry clearance. Now what I really couldn't understand though was why she needed to see my onward ticket out of Colombo, which was booked on a separate airline ticket entirely.
Wednesday, Thursday, Friday I'm flying to Singapore, and then 2 days Sunday to Australia. It's with Singapore Airlines. You want to see it?
One eternity later.
Now all checked in thanks to a really nice check-in agent. I thought that everything was going well, but turns out, not quite. Something in their system was preventing me from passing through immigration, and their solution to this was to go back to the counter and talk to the staff.
Alright. That's very nice of you, thank you.
Now I really thought that it was quite nice that she didn't just turn me back, but she said she'd personally walk with me. Now I really swear that I've never met rude staff in Malaysia. They're always down to help in any way they can. And second time's the charm, we made it to the airside. Man, that was so nice of her. She escorted me to the counter to check why it wasn't scanning, and it worked this time, but that was really nice of her. I don't know if they would have done that in any other airport. Now, in the early 2000s, the Sri Lankan government had a massive problem on its hands. It was fighting a 30-year civil war, and somehow Sri Lankan Airlines was still making money, even with its aircraft being bombed and burnt down. This was set to be the airline that not only brought the future of flying back to Asia, but was going to do this for decades to come. Now the overarching issue here is that this wasn't all happy-go-lucky. This man came into power and initially Sri Lankan Airlines had nothing to do with the political state of affairs under the Emirates management. The problem was, the government really wanted to change that. Sri Lankan Airlines had finally turned into something that the government could really be proud of, and everyone wanted to exploit that. But Emirates wasn't going to let that happen very easily. Now the downfall of this airline can always be cited back to one incident in London that shook the very foundation of the Emirates management. This man, Mahinda Rajapaksha, made a rather questionable demand and insisted that the airline block business class seats on a scheduled Sri Lankan Airlines flight from London to Colombo to accommodate not just himself but an entire entourage. Peter Hill refused this for obvious reasons. Kicking off fare-paying passengers to accommodate some freeloaders would cost the airline big bucks, and Peter Hill stood his ground, but this came at a cost. In a shocking turn of events, the government revoked his work visa and he was essentially booted out of the country back to Dubai. And by this time it was inherently clear that the Sri Lankan government and Emirates management were constantly rubbing corners. Emirates eventually called it quits and sold its shares back to the government, and this would essentially cost the airline and the taxpayer a valuable lesson. And the sad thing is, Sri Lankans never realized how detrimental this would be until many years later. But no dramas at all, Emirates was out of the equation, and this man said, "I know a guy. He's not only unqualified to run an airline, but he also happens to be my brother-in-law." The kind of nepotism that was nothing new to Sri Lanka. But here's the thing, this was all happening within the 2 years of Sri Lanka's war finally coming to an end in 2009. So you'd think the stage would be set for this airline to work hand in hand with the tourism industry and actually do something, right? Absolutely not. He set up some fairly random routes in Europe, which the airline didn't really need and without much of a feasibility study. The airline was captivated by what they perceived as glamour and prestige by flying to places like Frankfurt and Paris rather than its economic value, and these routes turned out to be absolute flops.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Now he also started leasing planes at suspiciously inflated prices and enlisted well over 6,000 employees to run a fleet of 25 aircraft. It doesn't take a finance major to realize that's a horrible ratio. But I think the most controversial aspect of this state of affairs is that government employees started using Sri Lankan Airlines as their personal chauffeur. Now you're probably thinking this is really bad. And don't worry, it gets a hell of a lot worse. Go figure, this man finally got arrested. We're going to uncover all of that soon, but we need to take things back to today's flight for a second because some of the essential findings that I want to uncover will be answered firsthand by today's experience. Now to delve deeper into today's experience, we need to understand what the Sri Lankan Airlines fleet comprises of, and bro, the Sri Lankan Airlines fleet law is crazy. So, at the airline's peak, they operated about 17 jets, but the problem was never how many planes they had, but rather the fact that they kept ordering or leasing aircraft they didn't quite need or couldn't quite afford. Now the first and most important one was the A350 scandal, and this grabbed headlines because no one quite knew what the hell was going on. Basically, they decided to order 8 A350s to support their quote-unquote long-haul demand, and long-haul for Sri Lankan Airlines isn't the same as what long-haul means to Emirates or Singapore Airlines. For Sri Lankan Airlines, their longest flight would stretch as much as 12 hours on a good day, and that's about it. Now someone eventually realized, yeah, they didn't really need these planes, but not before coughing out over $170 million in late penalties, paid for exclusively by the Sri Lankan taxpayer, most of whom have never stepped on a plane. Now recently, Sri Lankan Airlines got this new A330, and I was kind of curious to know why people were talking about it like it was the hottest thing about town. They had a ceremony, a water cannon salute, and hyped up this thing like it was going to do God's work single-handedly. So I did some snooping around and I found out that this plane is actually 14 years old. And it doesn't take a genius to figure this out, you just have to look up the registration number. But I think what bothered me the most was that the Sri Lankan media was inherently lying to the public by classifying this as a brand new plane, citing that it flew straight from the Airbus manufacturing unit in France. And look, at best this might be seen as a little bit of harmless propaganda, but at worst it could be seen as misleading and deceptive. Now I knew today's flight was going to be uncomfortable, I just didn't quite know to what extent that would be. This flight was packed to its brim, but only about 8 people, including myself and the crew, were terminating in Colombo. But this was actually a good sign, because if Sri Lankan is starting to exploit the transit network around the region, it has the potential to turn Colombo into a hub. And that's actually a very good sign and something that we need to look forward to. Now, Sri Lankan's narrow-body planes seem to be carrying all the heavy lifting given that they're being deployed to the airline's key markets, and taking us to Colombo is the A321neo. Now, I should preface this by saying that this is the most fuel-efficient alternative from the A320 fleet in its entirety as far as the airline is concerned. But how exactly does that work? Well, first you've got the standard A320, which is bottom of the barrel and old. Then you've got the A320 CEO, which stands for Current Engine Optimization, which is about 4% more fuel efficient than an A320, but not as fuel efficient as what we'll be flying on today. You're so welcome, Greta Thunberg. Now, boarding was called by zone, but today the zones were more of a suggestion than an actual enforcement. Anyone and their nan could board whenever they wanted. The plane goes to the same place and has allocated seats. I just don't know what the rush is all about. There's nothing wrong with waiting for your group to be called.
Everyone thinks you should wait, right guys?
Now, as soon as I stepped on board, my preconceived assumptions about this airline took a bit of a hit when I was greeted very warmly by the stewardess and the cabin manager of this flight. But in the midst of all this chaos, I thought visiting the lavatory now would be a hell of a lot better than doing this mid-flight. Bro, what? The flight literally just boarded. What on earth happened here in 20 minutes? The floor was wet. I don't even know how. Some random towel just chucked there, but a clean mirror, so I guess that's a positive. Now, the standard Airbus A321 features 12 business class seats but 176 economy class seats. The seats themselves sport a general seat pitch of 31 to 32 inches and a width of 18 inches. Your best seats in the cabin will either be 11 Alpha Foxtrot or the whole of row 10. The seats also sport an in-flight entertainment system, a coat hook, and a rather worn-out adjustable headrest. In fact, the seat itself is just completely worn out. Your tray table extends outwards and your seat also features a pillow and a blanket. And yeah, look, I think my life is together better than this seat pouch, and the legroom was on the mediocre side of things. Now, unfortunately, the seat dimensions aren't overly accessible online, and no, I wasn't about to start pulling out measuring tape, but I will say this. Given the aircraft type, this is what you could reasonably expect for a standard flight operation. Now, one thing that I really do love about Sri Lankan Airlines is the safety video, and yeah, we've touched on this briefly in the past about airlines that do safety videos on things that aren't really planes, but this one I kinda liked. It's put together very well, and it features a lot of Sri Lanka's iconic landmarks. Now, the pilot said something about adverse weather patterns around Lumpur, and I'm guessing this is why my seatmate was clinging onto his seat for dear life. But we're now ready for departure, so terima kasih dan jumpa lagi Malaysia. When Emirates pulled out, they left around the time a rise in nationalistic sentiment was at an all-time high, so the reasoning that the Sri Lankan government produced to the public was more along the lines of, this is a state-owned asset and we don't want to sell it to foreigners. And yes, I guess that's a lot better than, you know, the truth. So what did they do with the quote-unquote national asset that they wanted so badly? Well, turns out a hell of a lot. They opened up the world's emptiest airport and rerouted flights there and costed the airline millions of dollars. Now, they also just rerouted flights in general to suit their political agenda and would randomly boot passengers off flights whenever they wanted. All of this sadly affected the airline's reputation, and as the costs mounted, the airline's reliability dropped. But even while the airline fights to stay afloat, there's a lot of things that the airline does remarkably well, and I want you to consider what I'm about to say when you book your next Sri Lankan Airlines flight. One thing that's absolutely fantastic about Sri Lankan Airlines is the availability of menu accessibility on the IFE. I know a lot of passengers, including myself, talk about the importance of providing handheld menus, but for a flight like this, it definitely isn't necessary and also saves a lot of service time. And service-wise, there was a lot of call bell ringing, like heaps of it, and there were just 2 cabin crew tending to them. I saw them smile and very patiently take care of all their passengers. Sadly, even while they were being poked, touched, or even spoken down to. The crew just didn't seem bothered by it. Very cool, calm and collected. Honestly, I think I was a lot more upset by this. Now the cabin crew came down the aisle twice with meals. Today, you get an option of chicken korma, grilled fish or vegetable jalfrezi. 3 options for a flight this short is truly remarkable. And no, it wasn't just like some random tray of food, it was a full 3-course meal. I sometimes forget that this is the standard in most parts of the world, given that in Australia we've been dealt such a bad hand when it comes to airline service and expectations. Now for today's entree, we have beetroot and tomato salad, a very tasty entree and playing into a narrative that Sri Lankans can take just about any vegetable and turn it into a savory delight. I would honestly snack on this if I could. And for my main course, I had the chicken korma, which comes with a side of Malaysian pickle and steamed rice. Honestly, another delicious meal, very high quality ingredients and served with a lot of pride. Now Malay pickle itself is actually a very popular condiment in Sri Lanka, made popular by the Malays in Sri Lanka, and even though on this flight it was classified as Malaysian pickle, Sri Lankans very much made this their own. Overall, this meal was exceptionally good. Now for dessert, I would have liked to see something a little more inspirational than just some fruit because, I don't know man, this stuff grows on a tree. You haven't really done anything with it. I could have let this slide if it was a breakfast service, but for lunch, I'd like to see something more. And Sri Lanka has so many beautiful dessert offerings. You're telling me you couldn't pick one for the in-flight menu? Nonetheless, I was thoroughly satisfied. It was not only a tasty meal, but it was a high quality meal. I was honestly stuffed by the end of it, and Sri Lankan Airlines, you have got your catering figured out. Good job. Next up, tea and coffee. Now given that Sri Lanka is known for its tea, passing up the opportunity to get a cup of freshly brewed Ceylon milk tea would have been sacrilegious. Yeah look, it was more like some lukewarm tea with some creamer. And fair enough, this was economy class on a regional flight, for crying out loud. The bar wasn't set very high to begin with.
That's on me, I set the bar too low.
During the tea and coffee service, the guy in front of me started snapping his finger at the stewardess because he just couldn't wait. He couldn't wait for her to just move up a few rows and serve him. I was wondering, I thought it was an emergency, and this guy just kept snapping and waving his finger at her, and she was still a few rows away. She finally reaches us, and this guy's like, "Oh, I want coffee." Bro, she was serving coffee. You couldn't wait 20 seconds for her to get to you? No, it's truly mortifying stuff, honestly. And look, even my seatmate would just blow his nose into his handkerchief and then kind of wave it around or expose it with very little regard to the people sitting around him. And yes, like I said, a lot of finger snapping, poking and yelling, and yet the crew were completely unfazed by this. At some point during the flight, I spoke to 2 of the crew serving my row, and I had to let them know that they were doing an amazing job, because it was hard enough being a passenger today, but seeing what they were putting up with was a lot harder. And that classic Sri Lankan hospitality came through today, that's for sure. Thankfully, I tracked their names down and I wrote to Sri Lankan Airlines about how professional their crew are. As much as I was angry about how they got treated, I think they're absolute units at their job. Now the in-flight entertainment system actually did a hell of a lot better than I thought it would. There were some new releases and a few classics. The content is mainly available in English, Sinhalese or Tamil, primarily due to these being the 3 languages spoken in Sri Lanka, but again, for a 3-hour flight it was definitely good. Unfortunately, the headphones are giving off Timu and there's no in-flight connectivity. However, there is plenty of reading material that you can flip through and a comprehensive duty-free selection with a range of liquors, perfumes and souvenirs. No amenity kits available on these flights because, like I said, the flight is too short, but the general provisions are decent enough. So where do we go from here? Look, generally speaking, I think Sri Lankan Airlines was dealt a bad hand in terms of how it was managed. It was put into the hands of the same government that eventually got booted out by its own people. But can things change going forward? Potentially. But the airline needs a big reality check. Buying 13-year-old planes and trying to convince people that it's brand new is definitely not the way to go about with it. Now, because Sri Lanka is such a tiny country, getting an airline to run effectively is no easy endeavor. But it is doable. Emirates showed us that this was possible. And Fitzair, the budget airline of Sri Lanka, is also doing extremely well, so I think the era of making excuses is over. But here's the deal, I think the catering and customer service keep the flag flying really high. In fact, all forms of customer service, including their call center services, are top-notch. And if the passenger cohort hadn't been so difficult, this would have really improved my flight experience, but seeing the crew do the absolute best that they could given what they were dealing with was really nice to see. Now look, on a personal note, I don't want my viewers to be upset by this video, I really don't. My own father is Sri Lankan, and if I'm being perfectly candid with you, even he might not appreciate some of my critical insights into what I've said. Plus, I was born here and I went to high school here in Sri Lanka, so it's upsetting for me to see what the airline has become over so many years, especially because I know what Sri Lanka is actually capable of. So I really hope this can be viewed in the context of a historical analysis and a comprehensive flight review rather than me just being nasty. And the truth is, I want to share positive flying experiences on this channel, so if this video seems a little pessimistic, just know that I thought about it every step of the way. So would I fly Sri Lankan Airlines again? Potentially not anytime in the near future, but maybe a couple of years down the line. And to that extent, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all again very soon. Consider subscribing because it's absolutely free, and follow me on TikTok and Instagram for more tomfoolery at 38,000 feet. Have a great day guys, that's all for now.